I'm glad to present some ideas on psychotherapy after listening carefully to the other speakers, and of course, listening carefully to the open dialogue discourse by Jaakko, with whom I have the feeling that I share, if not a common tradition, or a common heroes, so to say, and perhaps we do not also share a common context of practice, since I mainly work as a psychotherapist in my private office with individual patients, although not only. But what I have the feeling of is that we share a spirit about the importance of dialogue. Certainly, what I will focus on as a phenomenologist, as a clinical phenomenologist, as I'm supposed to be, although I'm not so very happy to be labeled as a phenomenologist, to be honest, as I don't like to be labeled anyway. I will explore the patient's perspective, so the perspective of the patient. It's not this one?
The mice.
Okay. Mm. It's tough today, isn't it? Seguente. Okay. So, let me start with this image. Imagine that you or your patient sees a shadow. A shadow is there in the corner. Okay? A shadow is entering this room. What happens if a shadow enters in your field of experience? That's far too difficult for me. Oh, here it is. Okay. The epiphany or the appearing of a shadow is the appearance of alterity, of otherness in everyone's field of experience. We might call it anti-aha experience. If by aha experience we mean that experience through which we understand something that concerns ourselves, that is related to ourselves, that reveals something to ourselves. This is an anti-aha experience. Imagine that this anti-aha experience is what happens to your patient. This person stares at a shadow, who is the manifestation of the uncanny, something that cannot be understood. Now, I would like you to focus on two possibilities that your patient has. The patient has two possibilities. The first one is that after recovering from the disturbant emotions that he has by seeing the shadow, he approaches the shadow and watches carefully in order to understand what is it. This is a subject-object movement. The patient gets closer to see it better. But next to this subject-object movement in front of the shadow, there is another kind of movement that is a subject-subject movement. And it is a movement that this person might do by looking at you, who are next to her, and asking you, do you see it too? What do you see? So instead of watching at the shadow, she looks at you and she starts a dialogue with you about what we both see or don't see, or the differences between what one sees and the other sees. Unfortunately, this is the second movement, the subject-subject movement, the movement that the patient might do to start a dialogue with you, is not always what happens, it's not always the case. And the question is, why does the patient go for the subject-object perspective instead of a subject-subject perspective? Why does the patient go, or when does the patient go for this, when he goes for this option of an isolation in her relationship to the shadow, instead of going in the direction of a participation, a sharing with another human being while seeing the shadow? I hope this is clear enough. So, one answer could be that the patient does not trust you as a partner. So there is a problem of distrust. I don't ask you because I don't trust you. A second could be that there is a problem with ineffability. The patient doesn't have the word to speak about her experience, because that experience is beyond the borders of words, of spoken language. A third reason why the patient may not go the subject-subject approach is that the patient is spellbounded by the shadow. Spellbounded probably because the patient feels that the shadow is something that concerns her. This is what in psychopathology is called the tua res agitur. The shadow speaks of you. It is a private affair between the shadow and you, sometimes called as the experience of centrality. So there are several reasons why a patient may not choose to dialogue with you as a partner and goes straight to the inspection of the shadow, which obviously generates an ongoing feeling of isolation, and not only a feeling, an ongoing isolation. But there is also another reason why the patient may not try to start a dialogue with you while seeing the shadow. The resistance is not in the patient, but is in you. You resist to dialogue with the patient about the shadow. So the resistance comes from our side as a therapist or a clinician, psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever. Now, my presentation will be about a way to overcome these resistances, both the patient's resistance and the, let's call it, clinician's resistance. And I will try to reflect with you about a possible solution through the discussion of the method that we elaborated in these last years in the School of Phenomenological Dynamic Psychotherapy in Florence. That is called the PhD method. PhD is the acronym for P, Phenomenology, H, Hermeneutics, D, Psychodynamics. What is all about the PhD method? Let's start from the P. P is about phenomenology. Now, I'm very well aware, since I talk of phenomenology several times, that there are severe prejudices with or against phenomenology. So what I kindly ask you is to pretend not to know anything about phenomenology for the next 45 minutes. Please, at least, try that. I know nothing about phenomenologies, okay? Because everything that you may know about phenomenologies can prejudice your capacity to make sense of what I'm going to say. And of course, will impede me to do something reasonable and effective. So let's try to say something about what phenomenology is all about. This is a piece of paper, right? But this is also the way the patient comes to you when he is muddled up by his strange experiences, okay? Such a piece of paper is totally unreadable. You cannot even read what is written on this paper. Imagine that this paper, this sheet, is the surface of the consciousness of your patient. This is the paper where the experience of your patients are written. So, what phenomenology asks you to do is to unfold this paper. This is the basic principle of phenomenology. Patients come to, clinical phenomenology at least, patients come to you as such a paper that is ready to be thrown away, and what you do very patiently and very carefully and with your patient is to unfold this patient in order to make readable what is written on the surface of it. This is the phenomenological moment of the PhD. We call it unfolding. And we could also say that this is focusing the clinician and yourself on the what of the experience of the patient. Does it make sense? I hope it does. Okay. What about hermeneutics? Well, hermeneutics is a kind of abracadabra word, isn't it? At least for non-philosophers. People may have less prejudices about hermeneutics than about phenomenology just because they came about this word very seldom. Okay. But hermeneutic is the discipline that is about understanding the meaning of something. Okay? It's about deciphering the meaning of something. And clinical hermeneutic is about deciphering the meaning that for the patient has what is written on this paper. So, clinical hermeneutics is about asking the patient not only what is written on the page of your experience, but what you think of it. So, to take a reflexive stance with respect to her experiences. And then we can say that clinical hermeneutics, or hermeneutics when applied to a clinical context, is about the who of the patient. So it's about the way the patient, the who, looks at, takes a stance, responds, and makes sense to her experiences. What about psychodynamics? This is the most tricky word, of course, because at least there are several psychodynamics, not only one. And certainly the kind of psychodynamics that we integrate into the PhD method is not the vulgata of psychodynamics. It's not the traditional understanding on psychodynamics. For the moment, let it suffice to say that the psychodynamic moment in the PhD is the focus on the personal history of the patient. And then we will come back to this point at the end of my talk. So PhD means unfolding the field of experience of the patient, asking the patient to take a position in front of what happens in her field of experience, and then tracing back the present experiences to something that is already there in the personal history of the patient. Nothing new, I would say. This slide sums up the process. Phenomenology deals with the what of experience. Hermeneutic phenomenology deals with the way the who takes care of the what. And what is the result? Well, the result between this interaction, or better call it dialectics, is the existence of the patient, or what we might call in more operative terminology, the phenotype of the patient, the kind of existence that the patient exists. So, to rephrase it, the clinical presentation, or you may call it symptoms of the patient, in this framework are understood as the dialectics between some kind of experience and the way the patient responds to her experiences. This is a basic point. What is the background of this framework? Of course, the background is in clinical phenomenology mainly. Clinical phenomenology is 1 century of tradition stemming from Karl Jaspers, 1913, the first edition of General Psychopathology, and coming to our present days, certainly not unchanged. There have been several changes in clinical phenomenology. I mention this because I am aware that most people who think they know what is clinical phenomenology, they say clinical phenomenology is so-and-so because Jaspers said that. Okay? So I would say that genetics is not so-and-so because Mr. No, I didn't want to say this. Mendel said that genetics is so-and-so. So, Mendel is to genetics as Jaspers or Binswanger or other of our ancestors is to clinical phenomenology today. Right? Nonetheless, today's clinical phenomenology has its root in some basic concepts. The first, certainly, Ludwig Binswanger's concept of anthropological proportion. What is that about? Binswanger says that what we call mental pathology is the outcome of a disproportion between what happens to a person and her capacity of understanding, of making sense of what happens to her. So anthropological disproportion means that what we call mental pathology is the outcome of a disproportion between what the patient experiences and her capacity to make sense of it. This is, for those who would like to read or reread that, present in a seminal book that is called 3 Forms of Miscarried Existence, a book published in the late 50s. The second 2 heroes to which we are indebted for the development of 2 days, clinical phenomenology, are 2 German-speaking psychiatrists. One is Jakob Wirsch, who was a Swiss psychiatrist, active in the 40s and the 50s till the 60s, but his major work is from the 50s. And the second one is Wolfgang Blankenburg, who was a German psychiatrist who was active in the south of Germany, who has been active till the year 2000. The main works, the masterpieces by these 2 authors are, respectively, Wirsch, The Person of the Schizophrenic, and the title is an intellectual program, and The Loss of Natural Self-Evidence in Blankenburg. What do they have in common? They have in common that they understand, or they try to understand, mental symptoms as the outcome of a dialectic, of an interaction between basic vulnerability and the way the person responds to her vulnerability. This is the introduction of dialectical thinking into clinical phenomenology and to clinical psychiatry. But just to remind you of people who have applied this concept of dialectic in psychiatry, in the modern era, the first one who applied this concept has been Eugen Bleuler, who has been mentioned today, who was a psychiatrist in Swiss, who was much indebted to psychodynamics. He developed his own theory of schizophrenic symptoms as the outcome of the response of the patient to the experience of her own vulnerability. But, listen to that, the first psychiatrist who applied the dialectical method into psychiatry has been the first psychiatry in the history of psychiatry, Philippe Pinel. Philippe Pinel, in his Traité des maladies mentales, he applied the very same dialectical principle. And applying the very same dialectical principle, he could free mental patients from the chains in Salpêtrière. Because applying the dialectical principle meant that a mad person is not entirely mad, and that a mad person, as they would say in former days, is not mad 24 hours per day and 365 days per year. This is what allows a dialectic within the person, you see. So the dialectical principle, although has been taken over by clinical phenomenology in the 60s and the 70s, this dates back to the dawn of psychiatry, to the beginning of psychiatry as a modern discipline. And this principle has been assumed by a person-centered dialectical model. This slide tries to sum up what is the person-centered dialectical model, and summing up what I've tried to say, to convey until now. The psychopathological configurations, symptoms, and courses, which human existence takes on in the clinic are the outcome of a dialectics between the person and alterity, the shadow. From the encounter with alterity may stem disturbing, puzzling experiences. And the attempt to achieve a self-interpretation of these abnormal experiences characterizes the person's attitude, alongside with the comprehending appropriation, that is, the constant search for personal meaning. So to say, in a nutshell, when a person is disturbed by her experiences, there is a strive for making sense of these experiences. And what we call symptoms, like psychotic symptoms, for instance, are just but an attempt to make sense of abnormal experiences. Psychotic symptoms do not come out of the head or the brain of a patient like Minerva, who came out of Jupiter's head already armed, you see. They come out as the dialectic between the epiphany of alterity or vulnerability and the response of the person. So it's always, in this context, the outcome of a dialectic. So let's try to show this through a case study. Words of a patient. I had these strange energies inside. It all started like this. A funny, funny feeling, although it made me feel very vulnerable. I felt different from all the others, distinct from them, separate from my body and from them. I also felt as if my body was sending me messages from another place. These are words of the patient. This is the abnormal experience. This is the appearance of a shadow in the life world of the patient. I didn't change a single letter, just translated into English, of course. And this is the response of a patient in front of his strange, uncanny experiences. At first, I thought someone was poisoning me. Then, I realized that I lacked the internal wisdom that leads you in life. And all of a sudden, there came this intuition that they had chosen me for the experiment. I was chosen to incarnate myself in one body and to come to the earth. This explains why I felt a stranger in my body and a stranger on the earth too. Yet it was worthwhile. So we have anomalous experience, a bunch of anomalous experiences, and an effort of self-interpretation, deciphering, self-hermeneutics that comes to this sort of explanations. And of course, you may recognize some psychotic symptoms in these attempts at explanation. But we don't see them as psychotic symptoms in this language game. We see them as the self-hermeneutic of the patient, an attempt to self-understanding. And now, the context. Well, all this makes sense, says the patient. The Earth is a very elite place to go through, to reach a planet that is higher in evolution. Here, on planet Earth, everything is a task. Even drinking a cup of coffee. My destination after this, because I have a destination after this is just a passage. My destination after this is a place where everything is vibration, a pure state of consciousness, so elevated that everything is peace. All this makes sense. Strange, uncanny feelings in my body, feelings of detachment from the other human beings. My understanding, I thought they were poisoning me. No, this is not a good explanation. There is something more. They're not poisoning me to kill me. Perhaps they're poisoning me in order to, so that I undergo another difficult task, because they want to see if I am the right person. And then I realize all of a sudden, yes, all this makes sense. I am the right person. I am the chosen, okay? And all this makes sense because here on planet Earth, this is not my final destination. My final destination is another planet where everything is vibration. Vibration means no body. Disembodiedness, okay? Here I have to go through. That's fine. Including psychiatric services, you would say. All right. But then, well, I must admit that this strangeness began when that girl refused my intentions. Why should we not consider this? Why so many of our colleagues would not give such an importance to such a statement, not even writing in the clinical file? Now, let's try to put all these experiences and understanding and history in a row. Oh. There are some basic anomalous phenomena. Strange energies inside, feeling different from all the others, feeling separate from one's body, feeling separate from all the others, and feeling that my body is sending me messages to let me understand something. These are basic experiences. This is the coming up, the showing up of the shadow. But then there is a person here who does something with these strange experiences. She takes a position, in German they say Stellungnahme, which means responding to. The person is not passive with respect to her anomalous, it's a man here, it's a he. He's not passive with respect to his anomalous experience. He tries to make sense. These explain why I felt a stranger in my body. It was worthwhile. And then, through this interaction, we have full-blown symptoms. I was chosen for the experiment. What is this? A delusion. They would call it a delusion. Standard psychiatrists would call this a delusion. My destination after this is a place where everything is vibration. Another delusion. But of course, probably it's worthless to talk about delusions here. We are not in that language game of standard clinical psychiatry in which it is so important to diagnose a delusion here. Here there is a dialectic between some abnormal basic experiences, a way to respond to them, and then the structuring, permanent or transient, of some anomalous ideas that clinicians may call delusions. But of course, on the basis of that, or before that, there is something that has happened in the life history of this person. During the life of this person. I must admit the strangeness in my body and in the world came when that girl refused my intentions. We may call this a limit situation, a boundary situation in the sense of Carl Jaspers. And this element in the personal life, in the personal history of this patient is connected somehow, although we don't know yet how, to these strange sensations, but also to the way he tries to make sense of these strange sensations. Impotence, omnipotence, for instance, could be a conceptual couple that we could invoke at this moment. Okay, let's go back to the PhD. This one. All this strangeness that I feel, all this strange experience, came when that girl refused my intentions. Well, intentions is the word of the patient, means my intention to have an affair with her. Okay? A girl. Unfortunately for him, not a girlfriend. We may suppose that if she were a girlfriend, something different would have changed, would have happened. Okay. Or not, or even worse. We don't know. But something has happened at a certain point. By the way, I know that I'm kind of saying something obvious to you, but let's try not to forget that our patients, they have a life. they have some, they fall in love, and they have desires and the like, okay? This is something that is sort of forgotten, but not forgiven. Okay. Okay, what about the PhD methods? I discussed this method in a recent book that I published a couple of years ago. The title is Lost in Dialogue. It was published by Oxford University Press. There is an Italian translation of it, but I'm sure that you are more familiar with English than with Italian. I will tell you why the title is Lost in Dialogue at the end of this talk, okay? If I succeed in getting to the end of my talk. So, Lost in Dialogue is a book where I try to answer 3 paramount questions. And of course, I did not succeed, but I think it was worthwhile attempting. These 3 questions are the questions that we need to ask ourselves if we want to base our clinical practice on a sound basis and background. And these questions are the following. What is a human being? What is psychopathology? And what is care? How can we practice care if we don't have an idea of what is psychopathology or a mental symptom? And how can we develop an idea of what is a mental symptom in a human being if we don't have a theory or at least a hypothesis about what is a human being? Hopefully, these 3 questions should be answered coherently. So, the answer to the first question, to the second, and to the third should be coherent with each other. Otherwise, our practice is not well grounded. Okay, that may seem a bit paranoid of mine, I understand, but I'm not the first one who tries to do that. And of course, I submit this to my readers' opinion. So let's start with the first question. What is a human being? Well, the answer for us is very simple. A human being is a dialogue. A human being is a dialogue. But a dialogue with what? A dialogue with alterity or with otherness. To be human is to be in dialogue. I have no time to develop this philosophically or in terms of developmental psychology, but you know that there is quite a strong ground to support this idea. Of course, there are competing ideas, but okay, the idea I would like to discuss is a human being is a dialogue, but then a dialogue with what? With alterity. But what is alterity? Alterity is a collective noun. It means 2 things. We encounter alterity within ourselves, and we encounter alterity in a social context, in an interpersonal context. Alterity within ourselves, what is that? Well, the most down-to-earth encounter with alterity is when we feel an emotion. Our emotions are alterity. I don't choose my emotions. I'm thrown into my emotions. And quite frequently, they surprise me. Why do they surprise me? Why do my emotions surprise me? Because they come unexpected. Emotions are the first and most basic manifestation of alterity. But also, my desires and my drives are manifestation of alterity. But then, quite surprisingly, my habits are manifestation of alterity. Why can I say so? Well, because in certain situations, I'm surprised by having this habit instead of another habit. This means that my habits, exactly like my desires, exactly like my emotions, they come from a part of myself that is implicit if I were a psychoanalyst, would say unconscious, but as I'm not, I use a word that is more familiar in my tradition. They are involuntary. They belong to the involuntary dimension of our existence. Implicit, involuntary dimension of our existence. So, the first task of being human, because being human means to have a task. Being human is a task. It's not something taken for granted. Okay? Is to be in dialogue with the alterity within myself. But together with this task, there is a second task that is to be in dialogue with the alterity that comes from the so-called outer world. Other persons. Other persons are a challenge to my selfhood. They are a challenge to the permanence of my own identity. And of course, the social discourse also is a challenge in this sense. What happens when this dialogue with alterity breaks down? Well, I would argue that what we call mental symptoms or mental conditions are exactly the breakdown of the dialogue, of my dialogue with alterity. So a symptom, a mental symptom, is the outcome of the breakdown of my dialogue with alterity, internal or external alterity. A symptom is the crisis of the dialogue with alterity. But we can also rephrase this in more romantic terms, if you want. A symptom is alterity that shouts to be listened. Sorry. A symptom, I say it again, is alterity that comes unlistened and shouts to be listened. And then the obvious conclusion, what is care? Care is a dialogue with a method whose aim is to re-establish a dialogue with alterity. As simple as that. To re-establish or to establish for the first time. So, the PhD method again. The phenomenological moment is unfolding, as I told you before. How does it go practically? The clinician asks the patient to unfold her experiences and to focus on them. What's the aim of this? Is to empower both the clinician and patients. I would add today, and the neighbors, the family, whoever is interested in it, to empower them with a detailed, systematic knowledge of the patient's style of experience and action. This is abracadabra, but I think it makes sense. What is the habit of experiencing the world for this person? And what is his habit to behave in the world? And the general aim is to restore something more than self-knowledge, self-acquaintance, a kind of intimacy with oneself. I will come to this later on. Then the H moment of the PhD. The clinician practically asks the patient to take a position with respect to her experiences. And the aim is a resignification of experiences, to restore a sense of agency and responsibility in front of her experiences. And then the D moment. The clinician asks the patient to recount significant past events, those that are related to her present distressing experiences. And here, the PhD method goes far away from traditional psychodynamics, because here, the aim is not finding in the past the cause of the present. It's not finding in the past the cause of the present, but to retrieve in the past an emblematic situation that helps, makes intelligible a string of situations that were repeated in the life of the patient, whose association may have passed unobserved. So the kind of personal history of the patient is not a way to explain causally the present, but to retrieve an emblematic, paradigmatic situation through which the patient can better understand all the situations that have come after and that are similar to that past situation. And the final aim is to restore coherence and comprehensibility. I understand that this may not be very clear, but we can come back to this in the discussion if you feel like doing that. This is a hermeneutic understanding of psychodynamics, rather than a causal and explaining understanding of psychodynamics. Now, I come to my conclusions. Remember the shadow. I think you do remember the shadow. And remember the two movements, the subject-object and the subject-subject movement. The subject-object, the patient who gets closer to the shadow and excludes me as another through this inspection, and he sinks more and more into his private world. And the subject, that is quite an opposite movement. Instead of staring at the shadow, the patients look at me and he asks me, Giovanni, what do you see? Do you see something? Do you see the same thing that I do? The dialoguing attitude. Well, I think we should not choose between the one or the other. Both attitudes are important. They are both essential. Of course, the patient may need our help to go for the subject-object inspection. He may be speechless or wordless. He may not have the right concepts to make sense of what he sees. So the subject-object and the subject-subject attitudes should go together. But then, did I recount a kind of method that is nothing but another version or narrative-based psychotherapy? Did I say this? Did I try to convey the idea that what I think is the purpose of psychotherapy is to share, first to construct a narrative, and then to share a narrative with the patient? No, I didn't want to convey this. And although it may come unexpected, but what I wanted to convey is that the PhD method is not what encapsulates or grasps alterity, the shadow, through a narrative. Rather, it is what what brings both the clinician and her partner, her patient, at the threshold of alterity, that lets alterity happen and that opens unexplored perspectives. What I want to say is that the purpose of this psychotherapeutic practice, of this care practice, is not establishing shared narratives, but getting lost in dialogue, the two of us. Thank you for your attention.